Good morning. How are you guys doing today? Hey, welcome to Real Life Church. My name is Dustin. I'm not Vince, obviously, right? You're like, Vince got chunkier and grew facial hair. Hey, my name is Dustin. I'm the executive pastor of a church called Generation Church in Portland, Tennessee. It's about 45 minutes north of Nashville. And so I am honored to be here with you guys today. It's exciting to just get to see what God has done in and through Real Life Church. So I had the opportunity to serve at a church in West Plains. So I understand Ozark people. Now, I did learn that Missouri is not really the South. I don't know if you guys have figured that out, right? Y'all understand what y'all means, right? Yeah, no, some of you are like, who's this idiot? They let anybody up there. Hey, so I got to be here on day one when the church launched in the school, and I've been able to follow along since then because Vince and I are really good friends, and it's been amazing to see what God has done in this place. And I understand the ability for us to come together in a series like this and talk about all the things there are to celebrate. I mean, how a church went from the Daniels family, which is 20, something like that? Like they're those people who have the church vans for their family. So it's cool to see how it went from that to what it is today. And every step along the way, and as an outsider who's been a supporter, seeing you're renting an RV barn. Really? Okay, that's going to be interesting. We'll see how that goes. You're moving into a barn with the horse-chewed stuff on the side. All right, yeah. It's been amazing to see what God has done. And through this series even, as we've talked about how you can celebrate, and how you can learn to celebrate what's God's doing in the church. And even last week, over 40 people got baptized. I mean, that's just amazing what's been happening in this place. Now, we're going to continue today with this thought of party people. But how do you do that? Like how do you embrace the concept of a continuous party? Can you really? What about the day after? When, I don't know about you guys, when people come over to your house and then you're like, did they break anything? Or I have two children. I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old is crazy. And so when it's the chaos after the party, and by party I mean small group. Some of you are you throw down and throw down hard. And how do you live the day after when the party's over? And that's what I want to talk about today. How do we go from the extreme highs of the party, and life's bumping and you got your own soundtrack, to the quietness and the loneliness and the hurt and the pain that sometimes comes in those down seasons of our life. But life really is this roller coaster of emotions where we go from extreme highs and extreme lows. And so how do we learn to live in the broken places too? I would love to tell you guys, as much as I love your church, as much as I love the Ozarks, and believe me, I'm a hill person from Tennessee. I love the drive out here. I love the place. As much as I'd love to tell you I'm honored to be here today, it's a lie. As much as I'd love to tell you that JT being here today is awesome for both of us, and JT is a very dear personal friend of my family's, it would be a lie. Thursday I got a call from Pastor Vince. And you know how you get those phone calls, it's hey, this isn't let's talk about baseball. I still don't know why he's a Yankees fan. But we'll be talking. This one was different. This one was oh crap, different. And he told me about some of the stuff's going on. I know the church, y'all been praying for their family. I know you've been praying for Vince's mom and her battle with liver disease. And it was the phone call of something bad's happening. It was the broken phone call. It was the day after phone call. It wasn't the call of the party. It was the call of what do I do in the middle of this? So Friday, they had to make the hard decision. Dallas and Vince and the family were up, and they made the hard decision to pull her off of life support. And so yesterday, around 10 o'clock, Vince's mom passed away. And while I'd love to tell you, I'm glad to be here, I hurt for my friend. I hurt for the family. I hurt for the next few days and for the Mother's Day without Mom. But I also know that that's not a difficult season only he's in, that we've been there too. We've had those seasons where, you got that job that was going to be the amazing job. You're like, this is my dream job. They actually have a 401k. I don't even know what that is, but they offer it. And then you get that phone call or you get the call into the office and you say, hey, this really isn't quite working out for us, which basically means like you suck. I've had that phone call where like somebody's died and you're left with like, I didn't get a chance to say bye. Like all that guilt that comes with that. There's been those seasons where like you say till death does us part until you find out they really don't like you all that much. And then you get hit with that divorce paper that you didn't really plan on. Like who plans on that, right? And then all of a sudden it's not a party anymore. We're not bumping to the soundtrack. We're living in that tension of like, this isn't fun. This maybe isn't even what I signed up for. Like how do we live in that? And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how is God doing something the day after the party just as much as he's doing something in the party. If you have a Bible, if you'll turn me to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32. So we're going to take a look at a dude named Jacob. We're going to look at his life and a specific story of his life and how Jacob is a life of like extreme highs and lows. Like he's learning to live in the ebb and flow of the highs and lows of life. So Jacob was a fraternal twin. He's got a brother named Esau who was actually born before him, like just seconds before him. And so they're like daylight and dark different. Like Esau is what I think of like a mountain man. He's got like the beard. I'm telling you, this dude had like straight bootleg pants and a flannel t-shirt on. It's like a man's man. And Jacob would have been like JT, like skinny jeans and button stuff up, right? Like it would be daylight and dark, different kinds of guys. If you would read the story, you'll see like there's polar opposites. And so Jacob grows up in this family, and it comes time where his dad's passing away. And so in that day, there was this cultural deal where like they would pass off a birthright and a blessing to the oldest son. It was Esau's to take. And Jacob manipulates the situation. Like this is one of those, depending on how you would look at it, possibly a low point in his life, or it really set him up, so it could be a high point. But he's living in this moment where he basically robs Esau of his birthright and his blessing. Well, Esau didn't like it that much, if you could imagine. Basically it was like a double portion of the inheritance. Esau was supposed to be the man of the family, and he just got messed over. So out of fear, because Esau is a manly man, right? Like, people who can hunt and chew and like kill people in their sleep. So Jacob flees in fear. And he runs to a place with a family member named Laban. And so Laban and Jacob lives with them, and Jacob sees a hottie. And so he's like, I'm going to work for Laban and get Laban's daughter named Rachel. Now, this is a little bit jacked up, ladies. It was in a societal time when women were viewed as property. It's important that just because that's the way it's recorded doesn't mean it's endorsed by the Bible. But so Jacob works for 7 years for Rachel. Then either he was hammered. I don't know how this happens, like how in the world this happens. But so he gets married. They do what married people do. He wakes up the next morning and he's like, it's the wrong woman. And some of you are like, I've been trying to figure out how that happened myself. You wouldn't admit it, but so that's what happens. And so he marries Leah. And so he works another 7 years for Rachel. All in all, he ends up working like 20 years for this dude named Laban. And he has 12 kids at this point of the story. And so he falls out of favor with Laban. And out of fear, he flees Laban and he runs back home. He starts to head back to Esau. And that's where we're going to jump in to the story today. We're going to see a recurring thing so far, that Jacob's response to fear is flight. That Jacob's response in difficult situations is to embrace fear and not faith. And so for us, in the dark days when our party's over, what do we respond to? Do we live in fear? Do we step out in faith? Do we run from our problems, or do we lean in to our problems? So in Genesis chapter 32, we'll see an interesting story. It says, during the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons and crossed the Jabbok River with them. At this time, he has a daughter named Dinah also. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all of his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked, and he replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know what my name is?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. And Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. All right, so let's just sort of like see what's going on in the story. So Jacob, for 20 years, has been with Laban. He's sort of messed over his brother. And so now all of a sudden he's going back. He's fleeing from Laban. He's going back. And so in the flee, he sort of like reconciles with Laban, but he still sets his sights to home. And so like they're here, they have to cross this river. And so he sends his kids over. He protects his kids like a good man does. He takes his kids and his wives, which is crazy, right? Like you think one's hard, four. So he takes them over. Then he goes back and he gets his possessions and he sends them over. And then all of a sudden Jacob is alone. And while he's alone, this man comes and they wrestle throughout the night. Now, I don't want us to miss this fact that he's alone. See, some of you walked into this place and you're a room full of people and you feel alone. Some of you that day after the party's over, that day when you're living in the depression and the shame and the guilt, and you feel alone. That day when you're broken because of the news that you got's not the news that you wanted to hear. Or you feel like you're at rock bottom, you feel like you're alone. And what happens, like in this story, what happens in our stories, is God often works when we're most vulnerable. Like God is often doing something in that season when it feels like we're at our weakest point. When it feels like we're at this broken point. When we feel like we're uncomfortable and exposed. Like God's often doing something. Like it takes Jacob to be alone, maybe for the first time in years, for God to start to wrestle with him. And for some of us, we wonder, like, why do these things happen? Why do all this stuff happen that we have to navigate through the lows of life? And it's like in these moments, it's when we look to God. Like so many times we think like, I want that mountaintop experience. I want God to do something in my life in these highs. But the reality is God so many times actually works in the lows. It's the valleys that God is shaping us and molding us and refining us. For it's often in the valleys when we start to look for the light of the sun. In this moment, in this vulnerable moment where Jacob has no excuses, no one to lean to, no one to blame, like God does something in him. And it's in your vulnerable moments when God is desiring to do something in you. We also see in this story like the difficulties that Jacob's going through. And Jacob is in a precarious situation where he's leaving an issue, he's running to an issue, it's about to be a really bad issue. And what we can see in his story and our story, that the difficulties either defeat us or they develop us. Like it's in these broken moments where God is wanting to do something in your life. But we have a choice of how we respond. And you have a choice how you respond. Like I think of like those memes of like flipping the table, like y'all like meme people. Like what's a meme? I have no idea. Or the Arnold fist, you know. I so many times could see like that could be a response to this bad stuff, like just freaking out, or losing it, or running into depression, or running into loneliness, like wanting to be alone, wanting to be where no one's going to speak life into you. You don't want anybody to be around you. But in the reality, it's these difficult seasons where God is choosing to develop us. God is wanting to develop us if we choose to respond the appropriate way. Like we could easily become jaded or angry, depressed. Or we can choose to lean in that God's actually doing something in the middle of this. Like God is literally doing something in the middle of this fight with Jacob. That God is changing Jacob for the first time, where Jacob has had all these excuses, Jacob's had all these things that he could choose to do, continuing to flee, anger, fear, not faith. And God gets him alone, he gets him vulnerable, and he chooses to try to develop him. But Jacob has a choice of how he's going to respond. Jacob in the middle of the fight has a choice, and it says he responds with favor. He responds and says, "Bless me, God." Now, how do we respond in our difficult situations? Do we run to faith? Or do we continue to live a life of fear? Do we run to God, or do we say, "Hey, I've got this, I'll figure it out"? Like we take on that state of arrogance and pride and say, "Hey, I've got myself into this, I can get myself out of it." Like we have a choice of how we respond. And Jacob responds in faith. And it sets him up for where the rest of his life will take him. And see, what we can see in this is when we look for God, we can see him in the midst of our difficulties. If we choose to have this mindset of like, I believe that God's doing something in this, we can see God work. Like in the middle of all this, Jacob sees God face to face. Like every other time we're going to see, like throughout the Old Testament, like people died when this happened. Like Moses didn't even get to do that. Moses had the opportunity, and God said, "Go hide yourself in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to pass over you." And when he passes, his glory is so immense that Moses shines when he comes down. And Jacob sees him face to face. Jacob sees God in the middle of their difficulties, and it changes him. And see, so many times we have this chance that we can see God in the middle of like our stories, but here's the problem. Like we see our stories chapter to chapter, where God sees the whole story and is working what he's doing through us. We get that bad news and we're like, "Yeah, my life's over. Like, how am I supposed to get out of this? How am I supposed to get out of bankruptcy? How am I supposed to get out of this business failure? How am I supposed to work myself out of the death of a child? How am I supposed to cope with all of this bad?" And God's saying, "I'm writing a beautiful story, you just don't see it yet." That we live chapter to chapter and we feel like it's over. Y'all ever read like a books or I actually threw a spoiler earlier, so I have to apologize. Like I like Marvel movies. Captain America is the best Marvel superhero. Just saying, all you Iron Man nerds are losers. But you know, like every chapter leads to another chapter and always ends with cliffhangers. I know we're sort of in like Harry Potter. Like all that stuff sets up something else. And like when you read it, any book, pick a book. Like every chapter ends with this moment of like, what the crap? What's supposed to happen? Any good trilogy, if you guys, I'm a Star Wars fan. Like if you watch Empire Strikes Back and that's it, you're like, this movie sucks. This is horrible. There's like no hope. A New Hope, get it? Like they're intentionally designed to like bring you to lean in so that you can see the whole story. But they knew it when they were working on it. And in our lives, it feels like, how am I supposed to go from chapter to chapter to chapter? How am I supposed to go from this broken point to this broken point? And God says, "I'm writing a beautiful story. You just can't see it yet." Like this portion of the story in Jacob's life, it changes him. It changes him where he goes from a place of arrogance and pride to stand in front of Esau, and they actually reconcile their relationship. It changes their whole family dynamic. But it's because they go through this experience. It's because they lean into the difficulty, and the difficulty is setting them up for where God is leading them to. And see, in Jacob's life, here's what's happening. He's replacing the spirit of fear with a spirit of confidence. Like he's given Jacob the ability to be able to lead for the first time. He's removing these fears. He's taking the spirit of apathy that Jacob had. I mean, Jacob screwed everybody over. And he's putting in him a heart of compassion. And it happens in the difficulty. It happens in the fight. He's being changed in the middle of the fight. And the reality is, in the middle of our difficulties, in the middle of our tragedies, in the middle of all these setbacks, that God is doing something. That in the middle of your brokenness, and all those parts of your life that are the parts you try to ignore, the parts you try to forget, like God was doing something in you. He was trying to change you if you would allow him to change you. I remember when I was 25, my wife and I, we got married at 21, and it took us about 2 years to decide to have a kid. What were we thinking? But yeah, it took us several years to get pregnant. We actually were told that like we wouldn't be able to conceive. And you get that news of for some of you ladies, you get this. You're not a lady if you can't make a baby. I don't get that, but somehow how y'all think. It wrecks your world. We did what every sane people did. We went and bought sports cars. And then 6 weeks later, she's pregnant. Yeah. Hey, you can manipulate the credit bureau system and buy 2 cars in one day. I would not recommend doing it. It took us 10 years to dig out of that hole. But you know what? And that difficulty of being told that we were going to be barren, we found out that we need to trust God and not a doctor because he wasn't the great physician. A few years later, we're going through this assessment as leaders, and they're like, hey, is there anything you need to say, anything confidential you need to say before we go forward? It's yeah, you know what? I was sexually abused as a kid, and I've been married for 7 years, and my wife didn't know it. Because I was living out of a place of shame. I was living out of a place of there's no way she'll love me if she knows this. In the middle of my difficulty, God was teaching me what unconditional love is. When I was 30 and I had this crazy idea to plant a church, when I was 33 and the church closed, in this place of pride and arrogance, God is working in me, learning what it means to be broken, and learning that in my failures, God's often setting me up. See, all of these things that I thought were negative things, God was working something in me. God was developing something in me, not so much for where I was, but for where I was going. Because God sees our life in a complete story, not chapter to chapter. And when I look back, every one of these chapters has allowed me to be able to speak life into people because I can relate out of brokenness. And in your life, all of these broken moments are allowing you to be able to speak life into people if you choose to. The Bible tells us that God works all things together for the good of those who believe. That he's working all this stuff together, but it doesn't always feel like it. It doesn't always feel like there's purpose to it. But God is using these broken places so that we can speak life, and he's doing it so we can be changed. That he's creating something in us. That in our vulnerability, he's developing us. In our brokenness, he's changing us. And here's what he's doing. He's creating a limp in you. He's creating a limp in me. He's changing me. The Bible says Jacob wrestled with God all night. And when it was done, God wrenched his hip. I don't even know what wrenched means. It sounds painful, right? I'm sure the medical books, you looked up wrench, there's probably not a word. But it wrenched his hip. And it says Jacob walked with a limp the rest of his days. He didn't run. He limped. So what does it mean for you to have a limp? What does it mean for me to have a limp? It slows us down. It forces us to realize what's really important. Let me tell you guys something. Vince and Dallas know today what's really important. Slowing down. God's causing a limp so that they can see the weight of life and the reality of life. That sometimes we have to slow down, we have to step back, we have to see, what does it really matter? What does it matter if you, bank a lot of money and you lose your family? What does it matter if it looks good on the outside and you lose your wife or your husband? What does it matter if you have a successful business but you're a jerk? That's a good word. That's a word y'all won't freak out if I say. Sometimes I say inappropriate stuff, and that would have freaked some of y'all out. What does it matter if you do all these things? The Bible says, what does it gain for a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? That's right. And so many times, we don't walk with a limp to slow down enough to see the weight and reality of life. And God's changing you so that you limp, so that you slow down, but he's also doing it so that you trust in God and not in yourself. A man who can run, runs. A man who can limp needs help. And when we get a limp in our life, we learn that we can't do life alone. We learn that we're not meant to do life alone. That God is desiring for us to understand that our dependency is not on us. In reality, that's so many times what we do. We think I can earn it, or I can fix this, or I can make this right. And the reality is we have to lean into God. See, so many times the soundtrack of our life is like the Justin Timberlake song, or for you parents, the Trolls soundtrack. I got the sunshine in my pocket. I got a good song in my beat. You know, like all this stuff is what we're thinking about. But I'm learning the soundtrack of my life is so different. It's like this hymn, Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh, Lord, how I need you. Like the limp causes us to realize that like God is our source and not us. God is our source, not the kids that we desire to have. God is our source, not the spouse that you desire to have or the spouse that you're fighting to keep or the spouse that you've manipulated so that you can have. God is our source, not the number of zeros in our bank account. And like that's what he forces us to see when we limp, is that we need God. And our dependency needs to be in God. And that's why those valleys are so important. Because they cause us to look for a reference point. They cause us to look for Jesus. And so the reality in our life is like these low moments matter. These broken moments matter. Because what's happening is God is changing us. God is using all of these setbacks as setups, but we don't see it. So today, like whatever you walked in here with, you know, maybe you thought you were in the middle of a good season. Maybe you just got rocked with bad news. Like God is uniquely desiring to use you in a powerful way. Use all of you. That means those bad stories too. Like here's what I get dumbfounded with. People resonate with the bad stories of my life way more than they do the good. It's the bad stories where you can see God moving in it. It's not the good stories. And so for us in this place, maybe you feel like the party's over. Maybe you feel like there's nothing left to celebrate. I want you to know, embrace the reality that God is developing you. Embrace the truth that God is working something in your life. If you just believe it, if you just hold on. Maybe you've been there before. Maybe you felt like you were defeated. Maybe you felt like, it's too late for you. Maybe you feel like you don't have purpose. Maybe you feel like you don't have hope. I want you to embrace the idea that God has done something in you so that now he can do something through you. Amen. Like God wants to use you to share your story so that you can help change somebody. Like there's people who've gone through the brokenness that you've been through. There's people who are going through the brokenness that you have the words of life to speak into them. Go share it. Go speak life. And maybe your current chapter isn't going so well. Maybe you thought you were in the middle of a comedy and you woke up and it's a horror story. I just want you to lean into the fact that God's not done yet. That he's writing a beautiful story, a story of hope, a story of redemption, a story of love, a story of grace. But it takes time to see it. So hold on. It's not over. Maybe you walked in today with a limp and you didn't know it. Maybe you haven't ran in a while. I want you to embrace that God has changed you. That God has done something in you. That God is slowing you down. He's teaching you to trust so that you can do something with your life. Like in these seasons, in these dark seasons, in these valleys, and the day after the party, God's doing something in you so he can do something through you. You just have to let him. See, it's hard to get pressed. It's hard to feel like you're just being weighted down. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane means pressed, wine pressed. He says, God, take this cup from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will. He walks out of that garden into his purpose. He walks out of that garden into redemption. He walks out of that garden into unconditional, reckless love. And out of that place of pressing, he has the ability, he has the boldness, he has the acknowledgement that God's will be done in his life and through his life. And it's the pressing that God is giving this moment for us to choose him or to choose ourselves. It's this pressing that we have the opportunity to say, God, I want your will done in my life. Or I'm going to continue to do my selfish will. It's the pressing where we start to have our priorities reevaluated and realigned, and where we change. So my prayer for you today is to don't run from the pressing, but acknowledge that God is working something out of you many times so he can do something in you. God is doing something in you so he can do something through you. God is doing something through you so that you can make a difference for him. Jesus, I pray in this place, God, that you will allow us to accept our brokenness and not run from it. God, while many of us, we walked into this place with shame and with hurt and with fear and with brokenness, God, you tell us that we are not defined by what's happened. We are defined by who we are and whose we are, and we're yours. God, every part of us is yours. The good stories, the bad stories. God, that you are writing a beautiful story chapter by chapter in our lives. God, I pray that you continue to do something in us. God, I pray for future valleys that are on the horizon. God, that you give us the ability to walk through them not in fear, but we walk through them in faith. God, I pray for those of us who are in valleys, God, that we will acknowledge, God, that you are our source. God, that you alone are all we need. God, I pray that you will continue to change us. You will change us for the better, you'll change us for good, and you'll change us so that we can be difference makers. God, we pray this in your name. All God's people says.